There's a kind of silence that falls over a man when something changes him, not the silence of sleep or of peace, but the silence of seeing. The kind that drops over your shoulders like a wet wool coat and doesn't lift for days, maybe years, maybe never. I've spent 31 years keeping a logbook, not of cattle counts or rainfall or fence repairs, though I've got those too, stacked in milk crates out behind the barn. I mean a real logbook, the kind where I write down the things that don't make sense until much later, the moments that show up quiet and unannounced and then refuse to leave. Most folks, when they hear about what happened at the Rourke auction that September, they hear a story about a rich man and a donkey. They hear it as a kind of joke, the punchline being that a man worth 600 acres and 3 oil leases walked away from a champion stallion to haul home a bony Jenny, and her knock-kneed foal instead. They think it's funny. I was standing 6 feet away. I wrote it down that same night, hands still shaking, a little coffee going cold beside me. It wasn't funny. It was the truest thing I ever watched one man do. And I've been trying to figure out why ever since. The morning the Rourke auction opened, the sky was the color of old tin, not quite gray, not quite silver, just that flat September light that makes everything look like it's been waiting too long. I'd driven out from Mesquite in my uncle's truck, the one with the cracked dashboard and the AM radio that only caught 2 stations, a gospel hour out of Abilene and static. I'd listened to the static most of the way. It felt appropriate. My name is Cal Deaver. I keep a logbook. I say that up front not because it matters to what happened, but because it explains how I remember things the way I do. Most men who were there that day remember the stallion. They remember the price climbing and the crowd pressing forward and Rourke's auctioneer going hoarse by noon. That's what they write down if they write anything at all, the numbers, the outcome, the final gavel. I write down the other stuff, the way the light was sitting on the fence posts. The smell of manure and dry hay, and something underneath both of those, something older, like turned earth after a long, dry spell. The way Emmett Caulfield stood with his hat in his hands instead of on his head, which I'd never seen him do in 12 years of knowing the man, and which told me before any word was spoken that this day was not going to be what anyone expected. Emmett Caulfield. That's who this is about. Let me try to do him justice. He was 53 years old that September, though he moved like a man of 40 and thought like a man of 65. Which is to say, he moved quickly and planned slowly and was almost always right in the end, even when the end took longer than anyone had patience for. He was not a tall man, 5'11" at most, broader in the shoulder than the hip, with hands that were too big for his body and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from something that didn't give easy. He had money, real money, not the kind you flash at rodeos or wear on your belt buckle, but the quiet kind, the kind that had been in the family long enough that it didn't need to announce itself anymore. The Caulfield spread north of Laramie ran to 640 acres. He kept Herefords, some Angus cross, a small but serious quarter-horse operation that he'd built up over 15 years from 2 mares, and a borrowed stud to something people drove distances to look at. He had a reputation for knowing horses, not just owning them or showing them, knowing them. There's a difference, and most people in the business can feel it even if they can't articulate it. I'd met Emmett at a cutting competition in Weatherford 3 years prior. I was there writing a piece for a regional livestock journal, one of those small circulation things that nobody reads except the people in it. He was there watching a gelding he'd sold the previous spring compete in the intermediate division. He wasn't rooting for it exactly. He was just watching, studying it the way you'd study a piece of your own work after you'd handed it off, half pride, half second-guessing. We'd ended up talking for 2 hours over bad coffee and good brisket, and somewhere in the middle of it I'd taken out my logbook and started scribbling notes, which should have made him uncomfortable but didn't. He'd watched me write for a moment and then gone right on talking, which was the thing about Emmett. He didn't perform for an audience. He just said what he thought, and if you happened to be writing it down, that was your business. I hadn't seen him since Weatherford, but when his truck, a dark green F-250 with the Caulfield brand on the driver's door, 2 CS interlocked in a way his grandfather had designed, pulled into the Rourke lot that morning, I recognized it before I recognized him. I wrote it down, Caulfield's here. Came for the stallion, same as everyone else. The stallion in question was a bay quarter horse named Rio Oscuro, Dark River. He was 6 years old, 15.2 hands, with a lineage that read like a history of American performance breeding, dock bar on both sides going back. some Poco Buono influence through the dam, and a cutting record that had made him one of the most sought-after horses for sale in the Southwest that year. He'd been owned by a family out of San Antonio who'd run into financial difficulty. The kind of difficulty that requires selling things you never intended to sell, and the Rourke auction house had handled the consignment. There were 11 serious buyers in the crowd that morning. I'd counted them before Emmett arrived, because that's the kind of thing I count. 11 men with real money and real intent, plus maybe 30 more who were there for the spectacle or the adjacent stock, or the food vendors that always set up along the east fence. I knew 6 of the serious buyers by name. Emmett knew all 11. He walked through the crowd that morning shaking hands and touching elbows with the ease of a man who has never once in his life been uncomfortable in a room, which is a rarer quality than it sounds. But his eyes kept going back to the pen. Every time he moved across the lot, toward the registration table, over to the water station where someone had set up a folding table with a cooler and paper cups, his eyes went back to Rio Oscuro's pen, not looking at the horse exactly, more like checking. The way you check on something you've already decided about and are just waiting for the formality to confirm. I wrote he's already bought it in his head. The auction is a ceremony. I've written that kind of note before and been right. I've written it and been wrong in ways that made me look foolish. That day I was wrong in a way that I still can't fully explain, 3 years later, sitting at this same desk with the same logbook and a cup of coffee that's gone cold in the same way. The pens at Rourke's were arranged in a long double row on the west side of the property, which put them with their backs to the sun for most of the morning. Practical setup, less heat stress on the animals, easier on the eyes of anyone trying to assess condition and movement. The horses were in the northern run of pens, the larger animals first, then the younger stock, then a small section at the far end for what the auction catalog called additional livestock, a catch-all category for the odds and ends that came along with estate sales and farm dispersals. Goats mostly, a couple of mule pairs, some cattle that weren't really auction quality but had belonged to someone for long enough that they needed to go somewhere specific rather than straight to a feedlot. And at the very end of the row, in the last pen before the fence line turned the corner toward the equipment barn, there was the donkey. I almost walked past her. I did walk past her, in fact, the first time. I was making my circuit of the pens before the auction opened, getting my notes in order, checking which lots had attracted clusters of lookers and which were being ignored. The donkey pen was being ignored. Nobody had stopped. The catalog had listed her as lot 47, Gray Jenny approx. 9 ers, good health, companion quality, foal at side, Jack Foal approx. 6 weeks. That was everything the catalog said, companion quality. 2 words that, in auction language, mean not a working animal, not a breeding prospect, not worth serious money. A companion animal is one you keep because you want something alive in the pasture that's gentle enough for children to approach and hardy enough to survive your worst winter without much help. I walked past her on the first circuit. On the second circuit, this is the kind of thing I can't fully account for, the randomness of what catches attention. I stopped. She was standing at the back of the pen, away from the fence. This was notable only because every other animal in every other pen was at the fence by that point, accustomed to being evaluated, trained, or habituated to the ritual of human approach. She was not. She stood 3/4 back in the shade of the overhang, and she was not looking at the fence or at the people walking past. She was looking at the foal. The foal was sleeping, lying flat in the straw with his legs extended, the way very young equines sleep when they feel safe enough to let themselves down completely. He was gray like his mother, but paler, almost silver in the places where the morning light touched him through the gap in the overhang. His sides moved with his breathing, slow, even. The Jenny was watching him with an expression that I am aware has no technical name in animal behavior literature, or if it does, I don't know it, but which I can only describe as vigilance that has learned to be still. She wasn't tense. She wasn't alarmed. She was simply watching, present, paying a kind of attention to the foal's breathing that made you understand, without any further information, what her priority was. I stood at the fence for a long time. I took out my logbook. I wrote lot 47. The Jenny isn't watching us, she's watching him. Then I wrote, she looks the way I imagine a person looks when they've decided what matters, and stopped needing anyone else to validate it. Then I felt self-conscious about having written that, because it's the kind of observation that sounds sentimental when you read it back later, and I try to keep the logbook honest rather than decorative. But I didn't cross it out. The auction opened at 10. By 10:45, the preliminary lots had moved briskly, some decent quarter horses, a pair of mules that went for more than I expected, a registered Hereford bull whose price climbed fast enough to make the crowd lean forward instinctively. The energy of an auction is a physical thing. I've been to enough of them to know that. There's a point, usually around the middle of the morning, when the crowd's appetite is up, and the competition is hot, and the auctioneer's voice is finding its rhythm, and everything that comes to the block in that window goes for more than it should. Sellers know this. Good consigners time their best lots accordingly. Rourke's people had timed Rio Oscuro for 11:15. The stallion came to the block in a way that made the crowd go quiet for a moment before it went loud. He was exactly what the catalog promised: deep bay, nearly black in the shoulder, with movement that made you feel the quality before your brain caught up with what you were seeing. He'd been worked that morning lightly, just enough to warm him up and show his gaits, and whoever had prepped him had done it right. He was alert without being anxious, forward without being heavy in the hand, covering the ground in front of the bidding area with the kind of relaxed authority that comes from a horse that knows what it is. The opening bid was 40,000. It was a courtesy bid from a man near the back who didn't expect to win and was just starting the engine. Within 90 seconds it was at 90,000. Within 2 minutes it was at 130, and the serious buyers were starting to thin, the ones with real intent breaking from the ones who'd been hoping for a bargain and were now recalculating. Emmett hadn't bid yet. I was watching him rather than the horse, which was my habit at these things. The animal tells you less than the people bidding on it. He was standing slightly apart from the main cluster, at a position that gave him a clear sightline to both the horse and the auctioneer's block. His hat was back on his head now, pushed back slightly, and his arms were crossed with his right hand free, the classic bidder's stance, where the raising hand stays loose and unconstrained. He was watching Rio Oscuro with the same quality of attention that Jenny had been giving her foal that morning, which was a comparison that occurred to me only later, writing it down, and which I'm still not sure what to make of. At 150,000, 3 buyers dropped. At 170, 2 more. At 180, it was Emmett and 2 other men, a younger buyer from Colorado I didn't recognize, and Harold Fitch from Amarillo, who had money enough to go deep but a reputation for stopping before he embarrassed himself. Fitch stopped at 195. The Colorado buyer took it to 210, before his jaw got that particular set that means a man has found his ceiling. Emmett bid 220. The Colorado buyer looked at his phone, checking something, a text or a number, and shook his head once, small and definitive. The auctioneer called it once, twice. That's when Emmett Caulfield did the first thing I had never seen him do. He turned and walked away from the block. Not backward, not sideways, not while watching over his shoulder to see if the hammer fell. He turned fully and walked, with deliberate, unhurried steps, toward the far end of the pen row, where the additional livestock was housed, where the goats and the companion animals and the odds and ends had been waiting all morning in their quiet irrelevance. The auctioneer's voice continued. I heard it the way you hear background sound when your attention has been completely pulled in another direction, present but unprocessed. I followed Emmett. I don't know why. I've asked myself that question in the margins of the logbook more than once. Reflex, maybe. The same reflex that made me stop at lot 47 on my second circuit. The sense that something was happening in the wrong place, which is often where the real thing is. He was at the Jenny's pen when I caught up to him, standing at the fence with both hands on the top rail looking in. He didn't acknowledge that I was there, which was not rude. It was just how Emmett was when he was looking at something. The world narrowed. Other people became peripheral. The foal had woken up sometime in the previous half hour. He was standing now, close against his mother's flank, with his legs doing that slightly too wide thing that very young equines do while they're still negotiating the mechanics of balance. His ears were turned outward, alert but not alarmed. The Jenny had moved to the front of the pen, I realized, at some point between my second circuit and now. She was at the fence, but she wasn't looking at us. She was standing so that her body was between the foal and the fence, which meant between the foal and us, and her head was turned back over her shoulder watching him. Emmett was quiet for a long time, long enough that I got my logbook out, which I did the way some people clear their throat, automatically, as a way of steadying myself when I don't know what else to do with my hands. From back at the main block, I could hear the gavel. Rio Oscuro had sold. The crowd noise shifted, that particular dispersal murmur half congratulation, half the ambient sound of a crowd with its immediate purpose resolved. "She's been in 8 auctions," Emmett said. He said it the way you say something you've been carrying around long enough, that it needs to come out of your mouth before it calcifies. I looked at him. What? The Jenny. He didn't look at me when he said it. 8 auctions in 4 years. I looked her up in the Rurk system this morning when I pulled her catalog number. He was quiet for a moment. 8 times listed as companion quality, 8 times sold or returned. She's been to 3 different owners in 4 years, counting this consignment. I wrote it down. 8 auctions, 4 years. The foal, I asked. First one she's kept, he paused, far as the record shows. I looked at the foal. He had moved slightly, drawn by something, a sound, maybe, or just the inscrutable curiosity of young things, and was now stretching his nose toward the fence. Not toward us specifically. Just forward into the world, the way young animals do when they're testing whether the world will be interesting or alarming. The Jenny moved with him. Not dramatically, no lunge, no whinny, just a small lateral step that put her shoulder against his again, reestablishing contact, the way you'd put a hand on someone's arm in a crowd. Emmett exhaled. It was not a sigh exactly. It was something more complicated, the sound of a man recalibrating something internal, something he'd thought was settled. "What are you thinking?" I asked. He was quiet long enough that I thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, "I'm thinking that horse has been moving around for 4 years, and this is the first time she stood still long enough to raise something." He kept his eyes on the pen. "And I'm thinking somebody's about to buy them and split them up, because that foal's going to be 6 months old before the end of the year, and companion pairs don't stay paired in this business." I wrote, "He's not looking at the horse. He's looking at the situation." "They're listed together," I said. "Lot 47, both." For now, his jaw moved in a way that wasn't quite speaking. "Sale barn splits lot animals all the time when the buyer only wants one. The foal's a jack. He's not going to a breeding program. He'll go to someone who wants a pasture companion or a pack animal, and she'll go somewhere else and—" He stopped. The sentence didn't need finishing. We both knew what else looked like in that context. The auction had moved on to the next lot. The crowd was returning to its general circulation, the post-sale energy reshuffling itself toward whatever came next. Nobody came to look at lot 47. Nobody had all morning, really, except me on my second circuit and now Emmett, who had just walked away from a $220,000 horse to stand at a fence looking at an animal the catalog valued as companion quality. I looked at the logbook. I looked at what I'd written. She looks the way I imagine a person looks when they've decided what matters and stopped needing anyone else to validate it. I showed it to Emmett. I don't know why I did that either. I rarely show anyone the logbook. He read it, didn't say anything. "Read it again." "Yeah," he said finally, just the one word. I clicked my pen. "You're going to bid on her." He took his hands off the fence rail, looked at them, put them back. "I came here for a cutting horse." "I know. I've been planning this purchase for 8 months." "I know. Rio Oscuro is one of the best-bred cutting prospects I've seen in 15 years. "I know," I said. "He just sold for $220." Emmett looked at me for the first time since I'd walked over. There was something in his face that I can describe but not fully explain, a kind of tiredness that wasn't physical. The kind that comes from knowing something you're not sure you want to know. "I have a daughter," he said. I waited. "She's 11. She's been wanting a horse for 2 years. Not a cutting horse. She's not interested in competition. Just something to be in the pasture with. Something that won't." He stopped again, recalibrated. "Something that's been somewhere enough to know how to be still." I thought about the Jenny's face in the shade of the overhang, about the quality of her attention, about the foal's legs in the silver light. I thought about what 8 auctions does to an animal, what 4 years of moving does to any creature that forms attachments. Whether it was possible to look at that Jenny's stillness and not understand what it had cost her to arrive at it. "Your daughter," I said, "what's her name?" "Petra. And she'd lose her mind," he said quietly. "Both of them, she'd lose her complete mind." There was a long silence. From the main block, the auctioneer's voice rose and fell with the rhythm of the next lot. Somewhere to our left, a rooster in someone's truck bed announced something to no one in particular. I wrote in the logbook, he came for the horse he planned for. He found the one that found him. Emmett reached into his jacket pocket and took out the auction paddle, the flat, numbered laminate that registered buyers carry through the sale. He looked at it the way you look at something that is about to mean something different than it meant when you picked it up. Lot 47, I said. They'll call it before noon. I know when they'll call it. I know you know. He put the paddle back in his pocket, looked at the Jenny one more time. She had moved again, or rather the foal had moved and she had followed, drifting to the left side of the pen in that easy, unhurried way of animals that have learned to live in close proximity. She wasn't watching us now. The foal was investigating something in the straw, a piece of hay, maybe, or a smell, or nothing at all. Whatever it was absorbed him completely. She stood beside him and watched, and was, in some fundamental way, simply there. Emmett took a breath, let it out. Go write something in your logbook, he said. I'm already writing. Write that I know what I'm doing. Are you sure about that? I asked. He almost smiled, not quite. No, he said, but write it anyway. I walked back to the main auction area and found a spot where I could watch the remaining lots and still see the far end of the pen row. The morning had moved past its peak heat and was settling into the still, flat warmth of a September midday. The crowd had thinned. Some buyers who'd gotten what they came for peeling off toward the parking area, new arrivals coming in for the afternoon session. I kept my logbook open and wrote while I waited. I wrote about the stallion and the crowd and the price climbing. I wrote about Harold Fitch's jaw when he hit his ceiling. I wrote about the way the auctioneer's voice went slightly hoarse on the high numbers and then recovered for the call. I wrote about the Jenny's face in the shade. I wrote, what is it that makes a man's plan change? Not the plan he made yesterday or last month, the deeper plan. The one that isn't written anywhere but that you've been executing without knowing it for years. The one that says, this is what I want and this is how I will get it and this is what getting it will mean. What breaks that open? What gets under it? I wrote, I think sometimes it's just a face. An animal's face, a child's face, a stranger's face. Something that doesn't ask anything of you and for exactly that reason asks you everything. Lot 47 came up at 11:58. I timed it. The auctioneer didn't spend long on the description. Companion Jenny, foal at side, lot 47. Starting bid 2,500, who wants to begin? There was a pause, the kind of pause that means everyone is waiting for someone else to establish the baseline. Emmett's paddle went up. 2,500 from the gentleman in the back. I wrote it down. Nobody countered for a moment. Then a woman near the middle of the crowd, I didn't know her, middle-aged, practical-looking, the kind of person who buys companion animals for reasons they don't explain to strangers, raised her card. 3,000. Emmett 35. Woman 4,000. Emmett 45. The woman considered, looked at the catalog page, looked at the pen where the Jenny and foal were being shown on the near side of the fence, folded her catalog. 4,500 going once. Going twice. The gavel. I wrote Emmett Caulfield, lot 47, $4,500, $1 Jenny, 1 foal, companion quality. Champion Stallion, $220,000, Champion Stallion's new owner, unknown. Lot 47's new owner, a man who came for one thing and left with another, and who I believe understood exactly what he was doing and exactly what it would cost him, and who did it anyway. I underlined that last part. Below it I wrote, I need to ask him about Petra. But I didn't, not that day. I watched him go through the post-sale paperwork. I watched him back his trailer to the pen, a good, solid stock trailer, the kind that speaks to someone who transports animals with care. I watched the handler bring the Jenny out, and the foal come alongside her without being pushed or guided, just following the way very young things follow what they know. I watched Emmett stand at the trailer gate and wait while the Jenny assessed it, this new thing, this enclosed space, this transition. She didn't rush in. She stood for a moment, the foal pressed against her flank. Emmett didn't push. He waited with the patience of a man who has spent enough time around animals to understand that trust is always negotiated, never assumed. She went in, the foal went with her. Emmett closed the gate. I was close enough that I could hear him, though I don't think he knew I was there. He put his hand flat against the trailer side, the way you put your hand against a wall to feel if something is behind it. He said, quiet enough that it was almost nothing, "All right, let's go home." I wrote it down. Then I stood there for a while after the truck and trailer had pulled out of the lot, looking at the empty pen. The straw was still disturbed from where they'd been standing. The water trough had her lip marks in the algae on the rim, the kind of small evidence an animal leaves without knowing it, the record of a presence that has already moved on. I closed the logbook, opened it again, wrote at the bottom of the page, in letters smaller than usual. She looked the way I imagine a person looks when they've decided what matters. He looked the way I imagine a person looks when they've just figured out that they agree. I didn't go out to the Caulfield place for 6 weeks after the Rourke auction. That might sound deliberate, like I was giving things time to settle before I came nosing around with my logbook. Partly it was, but mostly it was simpler. I had 3 other pieces due for the journal, a carburetor problem in the truck that kept me closer to town than I liked, and the specific kind of procrastination that sets in when you suspect a story is still becoming itself, and showing up too early will interrupt the becoming. I called Emmett twice in that period. Short calls, he picked up both times, which was not guaranteed. Emmett had a complicated relationship with his phone that predated smartphones and had only gotten more complicated since. The first call he told me that Jenny had settled better than he expected. The second call he said Petra had named the foal. He didn't tell me what name, and something in his voice when he said it made me not ask. It sounded like the kind of name that would mean more in person. I drove out on a Tuesday in late October, when the cottonwoods along the creek draws had gone yellow, and the air had that particular thinness that comes before the first hard frost. The Caulfield place sat at the end of a county road that turned to packed gravel about 2 miles past the highway, and I always forgot, between visits, how long 2 miles of packed gravel feels at 25 miles per hour, with the radio only catching static. I parked at the house and nobody came out to meet me, which meant Emmett was already somewhere on the property. This was typical. You could set your watch by the fact that Emmett was never in the house when the weather was this good and there was anything at all to be done outside. I walked around to the barn side and then kept walking, following the sound of voices I could hear but not yet make out, past the main horse pasture where 3 of Emmett's quarter horses were grazing in the yellow afternoon light, toward the smaller secondary pasture on the south side of the barn. The secondary pasture was the one he used for new arrivals. Quarantine was part of its sensible biosecurity, the kind that any serious horse operation maintains. But Emmett also used it as an acclimation space. Not every animal that came to the Caulfield place arrived ready to integrate into the established herd dynamics. Some needed time to understand the topography of the new place, the rhythms, the other personalities. Emmett gave them that time. He was patient about it in a way that many operators weren't, because patience costs time and time costs money. And most operations run on margins that don't accommodate patience very generously. The secondary pasture was a good 3 acres, well fenced, with a run-in shed along the south side and a stock tank fed by a gravity line from the main well. I'd been in it before, walked it, knew its proportions. But I stopped at the gate when I saw it that October afternoon because it looked different. She was at the far end. The Jenny. Moving, and I mean actually moving, not the shuffle of a confined animal, but real, purposeful movement, head low, working the grass with the industry of a grazer who has made peace with a piece of ground. The foal was 6 weeks older than the last time I'd seen him, and it showed in every proportion, legs less absurd, neck beginning to come in, the silver gray deepening slightly at the mane and tail. He was following his mother with the automatic loyalty of the very young, but also, and this was different from the sale barn, he was ranging slightly, testing the limits, coming back. Petra was sitting on the top rail of the fence on the far side, near the run-in shed. She was 11, and she had the particular quality that some 11-year-olds have of looking both much younger and oddly ancient depending on the moment. In profile, she was just a kid with 2 braids and barn boots, but straight on, when she turned to look at me, there was something in her expression that had clearly been watching things more carefully than most adults expected. Emmett was leaning against the fence beside her. Not on it, beside it, with his forearms on the top rail, in the posture of a man who has been standing in that position long enough that he's found the angle that costs the least. I latched the gate behind me and walked over. Neither of them said anything when I came up, which was Emmett's way and which Petra had apparently inherited or learned. I stood beside them and looked at the Jenny and the foal working the grass in the late afternoon light. "She's put on weight," I said. "About 40 pounds in 6 weeks, Emmett said. "She was thin, not sick thin, just been moving too long thin. That kind you can fix with time and decent feed." "Foal's growing." "That's what he does," Petra said without looking at me. "His name is CeeLo." I got out the logbook. "Sky," I said. "It fits," she pointed, and I followed her gesture to where the foal had stopped his ranging and was standing with his nose lifted, ears forward, looking at something beyond the south fence. A cloud, maybe, or a sound, or the particular quality of the afternoon light that made the horizon line go blue and sharp. "He does that," she said. "He stops and looks up a lot." "Most foals do," Emmett said. "Not like that." She said it with the authority of a person who has been watching closely enough to establish a distinction. "Most foals look up because something startled them. He looks up like he's checking something." I wrote CeeLo, Petra Caulfield, age 11, assigned the name. Observation ray, foal's gaze, not alarm, but assessment. "How's she been with Petra?" I asked Emmett. "Better than I expected, better than I thought she'd be with anyone. She was like this from the start." He turned his head to look at me. There was something in it, not quite amusement, not quite the other thing, somewhere in between. "You want to know the story of the first 3 days?" "I want to write it down," I said. He looked back at the pasture. The Jenny had stopped her grazing and was now standing still in the way she'd stood at the sale barn, the same quality of stillness, that learned, deliberate kind. But she was watching Petra now, I noticed, rather than the foal. And Petra was watching the foal. "First day," Emmett said, "I kept Petra away from the pasture. I told her the Jenny needed time, and she needed to understand that wanting to meet an animal on day 1 is about you, not about the animal." She argued with me for 20 minutes. "I didn't argue," Petra said. "I presented counterpoints." "She presented counterpoints," Emmett said without inflection, "for 20 minutes. Then she went to school and I fed the Jenny by hand for 2 hours through the fence panel. Hay, not grain." "Grain's a bribe, hay's just providing." I wrote, "Hay is not a bribe, it's just providing." "Second day," he continued, "I let Petra come to the fence, but we stayed on the outside. Jenny came to the fence after about 40 minutes, not to us, to the foal side, because CeeLo had come to investigate. But she came, and she didn't come with any tension in her. She was just orienting." "What did Petra do?" He paused, looked at his daughter. She sat down on the ground. I looked at Petra. "On the ground," I said. Petra looked at me with the expression of someone who does not see why this requires clarification. "You're less scary when you're smaller," she said. "I learned that from a book about wolves. If you make yourself smaller than the thing you want to come to you, it has to decide to come on its own terms instead of yours. That's different." I wrote it down verbatim. "You're less scary when you're smaller. It has to decide to come on its own terms instead of yours. That's different." "The Jenny came to the fence," Emmett said. "Put her nose through and sniffed Petra's hair. Petra didn't move, didn't talk, just sat there." "Third day?" I asked. "Third day, Petra asked me if she could go in the pasture." He paused. I said yes with about 12 conditions, which she accepted without presenting counterpoints. "Because she knew she'd already won," Petra said. "Because she knew she'd already won," Emmett agreed. I looked at the pasture. The Jenny had moved, that slight, unhurried drift toward the fence line where we were standing. Not close enough to touch, just closer. "Has she let Petra touch her?" I asked. "Yes," Emmett said. "Lots," Petra said. "What's it like?" I asked Petra, touching her. She thought about it seriously, the way some children take questions seriously when they're not expecting you to be satisfied with a careless answer. "She's warmer than I expected," she said. "On the sides, under the coat, and She stopped, looked for the word. "She's like someone who's been listening for a long time and finally decided you're not going to say anything bad." I stopped writing. Read what I'd written, read it again. "I've talked to a lot of people in 31 years of keeping a logbook. Ranchers, veterinarians, horse trainers, auction workers, rodeo riders, anthropologists who study animal behavior, one Nobel laureate who kept goats as a hobby and seemed to find them more interesting than particle physics. I have written down a great many things people have said about animals." Petra Caulfield, age 11, in barn boots, sitting on a fence rail in October, had just said the most accurate thing I had ever heard about what it is to earn the trust of a creature that has learned to expect disappointment. Like someone who's been listening for a long time and finally decided you're not going to say anything bad. I wrote it again on the next page by itself, with a box around it. Emmett walked me through the operation after that. This was one of the things he did when I came out. He walked and talked, moving through the property the way he moved through his thoughts, sequentially but not hurriedly, doubling back when something needed a second look. It was the kind of conversation that required a logbook and would have been impossible on the phone. He told me what the first week had looked like, how he'd expected the Jenny to be difficult, to carry the anxiety of multiple relocations in the way that animals sometimes do, a kind of ambient wariness that takes months to work through if it works through at all. How he'd prepared for that. Called in a favor from a veterinary behaviorist he knew in Santa Fe, got some specific advice about integration pace, set up the feeding schedule to be consistent in a way that told the animal the world here was predictable. Animals don't ask much, he said. We were walking along the fence line of the main horse pasture now, the 3/4 horses moving parallel to us at their own pace, curious without being anxious. They ask for predictability, and they ask not to be surprised in ways that are bad. That's mostly it. If you can provide those two things consistently enough, the rest follows. The rest being, he considered, trust, which is just another word for knowing what to expect from something. I thought about 8 auctions. 4 years of being sold and rehomed and sold again. 4 years of nothing being predictable. Of the world being a series of strangers and new fences, and the specific bewilderment of finding yourself somewhere you didn't choose. Was there ever a moment, I asked, when you regretted not taking the stallion? He walked for a moment before answering. This was how I knew it was a real question. The ones that deserve real answers get a pause. I thought about it, he said. 3 days after the auction when I was doing the numbers, the stallion was an investment. I had a plan for what he'd do for the cutting program, what his colts would be worth in 3 or 4 years. That's real money. That's a business decision. He looked at the horses in the pasture. Lot 47 was not a business decision. What was it? He was quiet for long enough that I wrote a blank line in the logbook, which is my way of marking a space where something important was forming. My wife, he said finally, used to say I had a habit of deciding what I wanted and then closing my eyes to what I needed. A beat. She was right. She was usually right, which was its own kind of complicated. He paused. She passed 4 years ago. I looked up from the logbook. I had not known this. He had not said it during the Weatherford conversation or during our 2 phone calls. He said it now with the quietness of a fact that had been lived with long enough to be stated plainly without the need for anyone to manage their reaction to it. I'm sorry, I said. I know, he kept walking. Petra was 7 when it happened. She did what kids do. She got through it. She's been getting through things since she was 7 that most kids her age haven't thought about. That makes her, he searched for it. Older in certain ways. The book about wolves was her idea. She read it herself. I wrote Petra Caulfield, age 11, reads books about wolves. Mother passed 4 years ago. She has been getting through things since she was 7. The Jenny, I said carefully. You said Petra would lose her mind over her. She did. But you also knew something else, I said. When you were standing at that fence at Rurke's, you knew something that wasn't just about Petra. He stopped walking, turned and looked at me with the directness that was one of his most consistent qualities. The willingness to meet a question without flinching, even when the question was uncomfortable. I knew that animal had been somewhere too long without staying anywhere, he said, and I knew that was something I understood, and I knew, he stopped, started again. I knew Petra would understand it too because she spent 4 years watching me try to be somewhere while part of me was still somewhere else. He looked at the pasture. She needed something that knew how to come home. I did not write anything for a moment. I just held the pen. Then I wrote, she needed something that knew how to come home. We walked back toward the secondary pasture. Petra was still on the fence, and she'd been joined by Silo, who had made his own decision to come investigate the top rail and was now stretching his nose toward her outstretched hand. The Jenny was watching, not from a distance anymore, but from close. She had drifted in while we were walking and was standing maybe 10 feet from Petra, in the way that I was beginning to understand was her particular style of closeness. Present, observant, not quite touching, but there. "She never gets between them," I said, watching. "No," Emmett said. "But she's always close enough." "Always," he crossed his arms, watching his daughter and the foal. "She worked that out in about 4 days. Silo goes to Petra, she positions to where she can see both of them clearly. If he moves away, she goes with him, but she doesn't push Petra back. He hesitated. It's considered like she's thought through the geometry of it." I watched Petra laugh at something Silo did, a sneeze, maybe, or the wobble of his head when she touched his nose. Her braids swung. The foal pulled back and then came forward again with that universal young animal optimism, the belief that the world is probably fine and worth approaching. The Jenny watched. I thought about what 8 auctions does to something that forms attachments. I thought about it not as a number, 8 is just a number, but as a sequence of experiences. 8 times arriving somewhere new. 8 times learning the smell and sound of a different place, the rhythms of different feeders, the particular character of different water. 8 times beginning to map a world and then having the map taken away and replaced. What survives that? What in an animal or a person, if we're being honest with ourselves about what the logbook is actually for, persists through that kind of serial upheaval, and comes out on the other side still capable of the thing that Jenny was doing right now, which was watching a child and a foal with the quality of attention that only forms when something has found what it was looking for and recognizes it. I wrote not toughness. You'd think it was toughness that lets something survive that many transitions. I don't think that's it. I think it's the capacity to keep wanting, even when what you want keeps not being there, to not stop wanting it. That's the thing that's hard to lose and hard to explain and hard to name. But you can see it. You can absolutely see it. "Emmett," I said. "Yeah." "You said she was 8 auctions. You said you looked it up in the Rurk system." "Yeah." "Why did you look it up?" I asked. "You looked up her record before you bid on her, before you even watched the stallion go. You went to the Rurk system and pulled her catalog history first thing that morning." He was quiet. "You went to Rurk's for the stallion," I said, "but you looked her up first." He kept his eyes on the pasture, on Petra and Silo and the Jenny. The afternoon light was going amber now, stretching the shadows out long across the grass. "I saw her catalog listing the week before," he said finally. "Online when I was reviewing the lot list, and he stopped. "I wrote down the lot number, 47. I wrote it in the margin of the catalog page, which I don't usually do with companion stock." I looked at him, he didn't look back. "And then you drove 3 hours to Rurk's and looked up her auction history before the sale opened," I said. "Yes. Emmett." "I know," he said. "You went there for her," I said. A long pause, the kind that has physical weight. "I went there for the stallion," he said. "I planned to leave with the stallion." Another pause, but I wrote down 47 in the margin. I wrote he knew. Not consciously, not the way you know a horse's lineage or a price ceiling. He knew the way you know a song is about you before you know the lyrics. From the pasture, Petra called out to us, "Dad, come look at what he does with his ear." Emmett uncrossed his arms, pushed off from the fence, walked toward the gate. I stayed where I was for a moment, watching him go. In the logbook, in smaller letters under everything else, the stallion would have been a good horse. A great horse, maybe. He would have built the cutting program, won competitions, produced valuable colts. All of that is real. But Rio Oscuro did not need Emmett Caulfield. Lot 47 did. And Emmett, I think, needed something that needed him. I think that's the equation he was solving when he wrote 47 in the margin. I think he just didn't know the name of the equation yet. I put the cap on the pen and went through the gate to see what Silo did with his ear. I stayed through dinner. This was not planned. Or rather, it was the kind of thing that happens when you are somewhere that feels like something is still being said, and leaving feels like walking out of a sentence before the period. Emmett made something with elk he'd put up from the previous fall, served with bread that was clearly homemade, which surprised me until Petra told me she'd made it, which surprised me more. "She bakes," Emmett said, in the tone of someone who is still slightly amazed by this. "I learned from a book," Petra said. "Books again," I said. "Books are good," she said, as if this were self-evident. The dinner table conversation moved the way dinner conversations do when you're with people who are comfortable with quiet, in stretches and pauses, circling back to things, not feeling the need to fill every gap with sound. I asked Petra what she'd named the Jenny. She looked at me with an expression that suggested this was something she'd been thinking about carefully. "I haven't yet," she said. I looked at Emmett. He shrugged slightly. "I'm waiting until I know her better," Petra said. "You shouldn't name something until you know what it actually is. Otherwise, you're just naming what you want it to be." I wrote it in the logbook right there at the dinner table. Petra watched me write and didn't say anything about it. "Your dad said the same thing about you," I said. "Waiting until you know something better before you decide what it is." She looked at her father. He looked at his plate. She said. This was apparently all that required saying. After dinner, before I drove back to Mesquite, I went out to the secondary pasture one more time. It was dark by then, real dark, not town dark, the kind of dark that comes from being far enough from light pollution that the stars are the dominant light source. I couldn't see the Jenny or Silo, but I could hear them. The soft sound of an animal moving through grass. A foal's quick shuffle, a pause, the quiet confirmation sound a Jenny makes that is not quite a bray, something lower, more private. I stood at the fence in the dark and listened to that. I thought about what Emmett had said. She needed something that knew how to come home. I thought about the margin notation. Lot 47, written down a week before the auction in the white space of a catalog page that Emmett had looked at, and then set aside, and then evidently not been able to set aside completely. I thought about the Jenny's face in the shade at Rurke's, the quality of her attention, the way she stood between the foal and the world without making either feel the weight of it. I thought, how many times do you have to arrive somewhere before arriving starts to feel like something you deserve? How many transitions before stillness stops being a thing you've earned and starts being a thing you've found? I didn't write any of that. Sometimes the logbook is for processing, and sometimes it's for recording, and sometimes, at a fence in the dark, listening to the sound of something that has finally, genuinely stopped moving. It's for nothing at all. Sometimes you just leave it in your jacket pocket and stand there with the stars and the dark and the quiet proof of an improbable peace. The foal made a small sound. The Jenny answered it. I drove home with the radio on static. There are things you put in a logbook and things you don't. The things you don't, you carry instead. They take up a different kind of space, not the cataloged, dated, retrievable space of a written record, but the ambient kind. The kind that changes the temperature of a room you're in without you being able to point to the source. I kept the Caulfield entry for 8 months without doing anything with it. I don't fully understand why. I told myself it was incomplete, that the story wasn't finished yet. That was partly true. But the truer thing was that I wasn't sure I was capable of writing it in a way that would do it justice, and for 8 months I used incomplete as a cover for afraid to get it wrong. I went back in June, the June after the auction. Summer had arrived early that year, the grass already bleached at the tips by mid-month and the creek draws running lower than they should. I called Emmett the week before and told him I wanted to come out and close the story, get the final entries. He said, "Come on Tuesday." I came on Tuesday. The secondary pasture was empty. This stopped me at the barn before I reached it, because I'd half expected to see them there, the Jenny and Silo at their end of the pasture, doing whatever they did on Tuesday mornings in June. But the secondary pasture gate was open, and the grass inside was undisturbed, except for the permanent worn tracks along the fence line. I found Emmett at the north end of the main horse pasture, replacing a fence post that had heaved in the winter frost. He had the old post half out, working it back and forth to break the suction, and he didn't stop when I walked up, just kept working. "Where are they?" I asked. "Main pasture," he said. "Integrated them 6 weeks ago." I looked at the main pasture. It was a big piece of ground, close to 40 acres, running from the barn northward to a tree line of cottonwoods along the creek draw. The quarter horses were visible near the water tank in the middle distance. I looked for the gray. "Far end," Emmett said, without looking up from the post. I walked the fence line. The quarter horses tracked me with their eyes but didn't break off their grazing. They'd seen me often enough now to decide I was beneath concern. Past the water tank, past the slight rise in the middle of the pasture, and then the land fell away gently toward the creek draw, and there in the cottonwood shade, where the grass was greener and the air a degree or two cooler, I found them. The Jenny was in the shade. CeeLo was at the edge of it, in the transition zone where the cottonwood shadow gave way to open sun, doing the thing Petra had described, standing with his nose up, looking at something in the distance that may or may not have been there. I stood at the fence and watched them for a while without taking out the logbook. I was aware of the temperature of the shade, the sound of the creek, which was low but still running, a meadowlark somewhere in the cottonwoods making its particular argument with the morning. The Jenny looked at me, not the way prey animals usually look at an unfamiliar human, scanning, assessing, calculating exit distance. She looked at me the way she'd been looking at Petra in October, steady, present with that quality of having made a determination and not needing to revisit it. I understood from this look, someone who had been filed in the category of not dangerous, and this filing had happened at some point I wasn't aware of, and it was apparently permanent. I got out the logbook. I wrote June 15th. Jenny in the main pasture. Integration complete. She is in the cottonwood shade. She is looking at me like she's already decided. I found Petra after I found the Jenny. She was at the barn, cleaning tack with a methodical patience that struck me as unusual in an 11-year-old, and then I remembered she'd been doing things carefully since she was 7. Carefully was not a learned preference. It was a survival technology. She looked up when I came into the barn. She'd grown some in the 8 months, not dramatically, but the way children grow when you're not watching them every week, in the sudden proportions of a person becoming more themselves. "Did you find them?" she said. "Cottonwood shade at the far end," I said. "That's her spot," she said. "She picked it herself in the first week. She went through the whole pasture and that's where she stopped." "Smart choice," I said. "Shade, water, sight lines to the whole pasture." "She's smart," Petra said. "People underestimate her because she's a donkey, not a horse. But she figured out the social stuff with the quarter horses in 4 days, and Dad said most new horses take 2 weeks minimum." I got out the logbook. "What was that like, the social stuff?" Petra set down the rag she was using and appeared to consider this with the seriousness it deserved. "The mare, the bay one, Resita, she was the one who set the tone. She's the boss of the pasture. And Resita went at her the first day. Nothing bad, just the normal I'm establishing something way horses do. And the Jenny," Petra almost smiled, "just waited. Waited. Just stood there. Resita did all the posturing, and the Jenny just stood and waited until Resita was done, and then walked to the water tank and drank. And then Resita followed her to the water tank and drank too. I wrote Jenny waited until Resita finished, then walked to the water, then Resita followed." "That's an unusual response," I said. "That's what Dad said. He said most new animals either fight back or submit. She did neither. She just waited for it to pass and then went and did the thing she needed to do anyway." Petra picked up the rag again. "I think she's done that before, a lot, just waited for things to pass. 8 auctions, 4 years. "Does she have a name yet?" I asked. Petra looked at me steadily. "Yes," she said. "I waited. I named her in March," she said. "I didn't tell Dad until April because I wanted to make sure it was right first." "What is it?" I asked. "Constancia," she said. "It's Spanish. It means persistence or steadiness, both." She looked at the rag in her hands. "It means the kind of thing that stays itself no matter how many times it gets moved." I wrote Constancia. Named by Petra Caulfield, age 11 in March. Definition provided. The kind of thing that stays itself no matter how many times it gets moved. I looked at what I'd written, read it twice. "How'd you find that word?" I asked. "Book," she said. "Of course," I said. She almost smiled again. "I went through a lot of names," she said. "I tried English ones first. Patience, steady, grace. They weren't wrong, but they weren't her. And then I started looking at Spanish because I figured she'd heard Spanish her whole life. She came from a livestock area where..." She stopped. "I don't know if animals know the language of their names, but it seemed like the right language." I sat with that for a moment. The barn smelled of hay and leather oil, and the particular clean animal smell of a well-kept operation. A swallow moved through the rafters. "Petra," I said, "can I ask you something about when your mom passed?" She looked at me. Something careful came into her eyes, not closed, not defensive, just careful, the way you look when someone is about to touch something that still has edges. "Yes," she said. "Your dad said you did what kids do, that you got through it." Yes. What did that mean, getting through it? She was quiet for a while, long enough that I thought she was deciding not to answer, which I would have understood. I got very still, she said. Inside, I got very still and very quiet, and I waited for it to pass, and it didn't pass, it just changed. It changed into something different, not smaller, just different. She smoothed the rag across the bridle she was cleaning with a small, precise motion. And I figured out that you don't stop being sad, you just stop only being that. Eventually you're sad and also other things, and the other things start to matter again. I wrote it all down, every word. And you're sad and also, I said. And also I have a donkey named Constantia, and a foal named Silo, and a dad who... She stopped. Something moved across her face that I wasn't going to try to name in the logbook. A dad who wrote 47 in a margin when he thought he was going to the auction to buy a horse. I looked up from the logbook. He told you, I said. He tells me things, she said. He tells me more things than he used to, since Mom. She looked at the bridle in her hands. I think he realized that not telling people things is its own kind of moving around. You can be in the same place and still be elsewhere. I wrote, not telling people things is its own kind of moving around. You can be in the same place and still be elsewhere. I clicked my pen, put the cap on, looked at Petra Caulfield in the barn with the tack and the swallows and the particular quality of light that comes through hay-dusted barn doors in June. You're going to be something else, I said. She looked at me. I already am something, she said, not arrogant, just factual. She had clearly thought about this and concluded it was true and saw no reason to pretend otherwise. I laughed. Genuinely, the kind that comes up without warning. She watched me laugh with the expression of someone who is pleased but would not say so. I spent the afternoon with Emmett, finishing my circuit of the property in the way we always did, walking and talking. His pace, his sequence. The quarter horses had been moved to a north pasture temporarily while some fence work was done. So the main pasture held only Constantia and Silo and the occasional incursion of Petra, who came through twice in the afternoon on no particular errand, except what seemed to be a general orientation toward wherever the Jenny was. She checks on her, Emmett said, watching Petra make her second circuit. 3-4 times a day minimum. Even when there's nothing to check. Is she worried about her? I don't think it's worry, he said. I think it's the same thing Constantia does. She just positions to where she can see. I thought about the geometry of that. A woman, a girl, and an animal, each the other's fixed point. Each establishing the kind of stability that comes not from never moving, but from always knowing where the other is. Emmett, I said, I need to ask you the question I didn't ask at Rurke's. He kept walking, all right. You stood at that fence for a long time after you told me about Petra, about her needing something that knew how to be still. I watched where I was stepping in the uneven pasture grass. And then you walked away to buy lot 47, and right before you walked away you said, I opened the logbook and read it, I know what I'm doing. And when I said, are you sure? You said, no, but write it anyway. Yeah. What were you afraid of? He was quiet for the full length of time it took us to walk to the cottonwood line. In the shade, Constantia was still at her spot. Silo had returned to her from wherever he'd been ranging and was pressed against her flank in the easy, habitual way of young things that have a reliable place to return to. I was afraid, Emmett said slowly, that I was making a decision that felt right for all the reasons that are about me and not enough of the reasons that are about what's actually right. He paused. That's a hard distinction to make in real time, whether you're doing the generous thing or just the thing that makes you feel like you're doing the generous thing. And now, looking back, he watched Constantia in the shade. She was watching Silo now, the same quality of attention she'd had at Rurke's, the same deliberate stillness. But Silo was different. In October, he'd been knock-kneed and uncertain. In June, he was finding himself, the way young animals do in the good months, becoming more confident in his own proportions. And he went to his mother and away from her in the rhythm of a creature that trusts the going because it trusts the returning. Now I think I was right about the thing I was doing, Emmett said, but wrong about the reason I was doing it. I thought I was doing it for Petra. He paused. I was, but I was also doing it for me, and that's... He stopped. I used to think wanting something for yourself was automatically a lesser reason than wanting it for someone else. I'm not sure that's true anymore. I wrote it carefully because it felt like the kind of thing that gets collapsed when you try to speed through it. Your wife, I said. He didn't tense or deflect. Margaret, he said. She said you had a habit of deciding what you wanted, and then closing your eyes to what you needed. She was right. And Lot 47 was. Lot 47 was the first time in a long time, he said, that I did both at once, wanted something and needed it. Saw what I wanted and admitted that it was also what I needed. He was quiet for a moment. Margaret would have liked that. She'd have been insufferably pleased about it. She'd have brought it up at Thanksgiving. I heard something in that, not grief exactly, but the specific residue of grief that is made of familiar things that are no longer possible. The way a person gets specific when they're remembering someone accurately. Not the whole person, because the whole person can't be held in a single moment, but the particular detail that carries the whole. Margaret, insufferably pleased, Thanksgiving. She sounds like someone I would have liked, I said. Most people did, he said. She was very easy to like. She was also very hard to fool, which are different categories, and she managed both at the same time without effort. He looked at the creek. Petra got the latter. I noticed, I said. He almost smiled. The same almost smile I'd seen at Rurke's, the one that didn't quite complete itself but was better for that, more private, more his. Late in the afternoon, with the sun going long and the shadows pulling east, Petra came to the cottonwood shade. She didn't come with a purpose I could identify. She didn't bring feed or a lead rope or anything that suggested a task. She came the way she went everywhere on the property, like she belonged in it, and it knew that, and neither of them had to make an announcement about it. Constantia watched her come. Silo, who had been dozing in the shade with that collapsed-looking posture of young equines in light sleep, lifted his head, saw Petra, stood up with the slightly comedic efficiency of something that has learned that certain arrivals are worth being awake for. Petra sat on the ground. Not against the fence, not on a fence rail, on the ground in the cottonwood shade, with her back against the trunk of the largest of the trees, and her legs out straight and her hands in her lap. She'd brought something to read, a paperback that I was too far away to identify, and she opened it and read. Silo came to her. He did this with the complete confidence of an animal that has never been given a reason to doubt the reception it will receive. He put his nose in her hair. She reached up with one hand, without looking up from the book, and scratched behind his ear in the way that she'd clearly learned was exactly right. Because he did the thing young equines do when they get the right scratch, a kind of whole-body satisfaction that moves from the ears back. Constantia watched this for a while, long enough that I had the pen out but wasn't writing anything. Then she walked over. Not quickly, not dramatically, with the same unhurried quality that characterized everything she did, as though she had understood from some point in her past that urgency was usually less useful than steadiness, and had made her peace with this. She came to Petra's other side, not Silo's side, the opposite side, and she stood there. And she lowered her head, and she put her nose on Petra's knee, and she kept it there. Petra looked up from the book. She looked at Constantia for a long moment, at the gray head on her knee, at the long ears relaxed sideways, at the animal that had been in 8 auctions and 4 years of somewhere else, and had arrived at this June afternoon in a cottonwood shade on a property in Wyoming with a child who'd been getting through things since she was 7. Petra put the book down. She put both hands very carefully on Constantia's face, the flat palms on the broad cheeks, the thumbs near the eyes, the way you hold something you want to look at properly. Constantia didn't pull away. Emmett beside me had gone completely still. I wrote nothing. I was holding the pen, but I wrote nothing. Some things you put in the logbook and some things you carry. I decided, in the space of about 3 seconds, that I would carry this one, that I would write around it and near it but not attempt to capture it directly, because the attempt would require a reduction, and the reduction would be a lie. What I will say is this. Petra Caulfield, age 11.5, in the cottonwood shade in June, holding the face of an animal named Constantia, said something that I was too far away to hear. It was short, a sentence, maybe 2. Not a command and not a question and not a name being called. Just something she said in the way you say something to something that you're sure is listening. Constantia's eyes, which were large and deep and the particular brown of creek water in autumn, stayed open, stayed on Petra. Then Petra let go, picked up her book, and kept reading. And Constantia stayed where she was, standing, present, On the other side of the child from the foal, completing a geometry that nobody had designed, but that seemed, looking at it from where I was standing, exactly correct. I left before sunset. I had what I needed for the piece, more than I needed, in fact, which was a familiar problem. 31 years of keeping a logbook means 31 years of accumulating more than you can use, more than any single piece can hold. You learn to choose. You learn that the thing you leave out can matter as much as the thing you put in. Emmett walked me to the truck. This was his habit. He always walked visitors to their vehicles, which was a courtesy so practiced it had become invisible, the kind of thing you only notice when you think about it afterward. At the truck, I turned and asked him the question I'd been holding since the barn. "Did Petra tell you what she said to Constantia?" I asked, "just now in the shade." He looked at me, looked at the pasture where the evening light was going gold in the cottonwoods and you could just make out the shapes of them, Petra, Constantia, Silo, in the dappled distance. "Yes," he said. "Will you tell me?" He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that is making a decision about what belongs where. She said, "I know it's still hard sometimes, but it's going to be okay here." "I promise." I put my hand on the door of the truck. I looked at the cottonwoods. "And you think Constantia—" "I think she understood," he said. "I don't know what she understood. I'm not going to claim to know that, but he paused. She stayed." I nodded. I got in the truck. I drove down the gravel road with the radio not even reaching static. Just silence. The FM scan failing to find anything between the Caulfield property and the first edge of Mesquite's signal range. 2 miles of silence on packed gravel, which I have told you feels long. It felt longer this time. I pulled over halfway out. Not because anything was wrong, because something was right, in the specific uncomfortable way that things being right sometimes requires you to stop moving and just sit with it for a minute. I opened the logbook. I wrote at the top of a fresh page, "What Emmett Caulfield bought at the Rourke auction September was not what he came for. He knows this. He has thought about it enough that he can say it plainly. He came for a horse worth $220,000, and he bought a companion Jenny and her foal for $4,500, and the numbers are real, and the things those numbers represent are real, and none of that is the most important thing about what happened. The most important thing is the margin notation. The 47 he wrote in the margin of a catalog he'd set aside. The most important thing is Petra, who waited until she knew something better before she gave it a name. The most important thing is Constantia, 8 auctions, 4 years, and still capable of putting her nose on someone's knee in the June shade and staying there. I have been keeping a logbook for 31 years. I write down what I see. I write down what it might mean. I try to be honest about the difference between those two categories. I am not entirely sure what this means. I know what I saw. I saw a man decide. I saw a child name something. I saw an animal stay. The rest of it, the why and the how and the thing underneath the thing, that's not in the logbook. I'm carrying it. Some things you carry. I closed the logbook. Started the truck, pulled back onto the gravel. 2 miles of silence, and then the radio found something, not the gospel hour, not static, but a song I didn't recognize, coming in clear from somewhere west of Mesquite. A voice I couldn't quite place singing something slow and sincere in the particular key that is neither happy nor sad, but is honest in a way that feels like both.